Chris Watts made a number of mistakes before and after the murders, which ultimately led to his conviction. Many of the errors could have been avoided with common sense. But what if Chris deliberately made the mistakes because he wanted to get caught? We know that the murders were premeditated, so why did Chris choose the day that Shanann had a doctor's appointment and on Belle and Celeste's first day of school? What if Chris picked that day in order to give Nicole Atkinson the perfect opportunity to call in the welfare check? Why did Chris load the bodies of his family in front of the house and take the risk of someone potentially seeing him? Why didn't he take them out the back where there were no cameras and the houses were unoccupied? If he took him out the back, Nate's security video of Chris loading the bodies of his family into his truck would be non-existent. Chris knew that if he backed into the driveway, that it would trigger Nate's security camera and it would capture him loading the bodies of his family into his truck. Why would he go through the trouble of faking his family's disappearance after he had already potentially incriminated himself? But if he wanted to push a narrative onto the public, what better way to do it than to let them see it for themselves? However, the video footage doesn't actually show any physical evidence of Chris loading any bodies into his truck, therefore leaving only circumstantial evidence. There was a similar situation with the Las Vegas shooting. The mainstream media pushed the narrative that Stephen Paddock shot out of his 32nd floor hotel room onto concertgoers. However, there was no physical evidence to back up that claim. With only circumstantial evidence, people began to question the official narrative. It wasn't long until the crime scene photos of Stephen Paddock's deceased body in the hotel room were intentionally leaked in an attempt to further push the official narrative. Many have questioned whether or not Chris actually loaded the bodies of his family into his truck on his own. Dead weight is extremely difficult to lift, and Shanann being pregnant would have made it even more difficult, if not impossible. Chris also never appears to be tired, struggling, or out of breath. Although it does appear that Chris is loading the bodies of his family, the physical evidence just isn't there. Chris disposed of the bodies at an oil site owned by the company he worked for. Had he not confessed, that would have been the first place that investigators would have looked. You have to wonder what Chris was thinking when he left behind 6 pieces of evidence. But what if he deliberately left them there, simply because he was following the narrative?
The home, when law enforcement arrived, was locked up tight from the inside. The only way that the law enforcement could get in was getting Mr. Watts there with a garage door opener to let law enforcement in. There was no way anyone was going to get into that house as a stranger, do something to that family, and get back out and leave the house locked up in that manner. I think that was probably the most compelling thing that struck law enforcement almost immediately.
If there were multiple ways Shanann could have left the house, it would open up the possibility that someone else may have been responsible for their disappearance, therefore taking the focus away from Chris and the official narrative. When investigators started to interrogate him, Chris never asked for a lawyer. He also agreed to take a polygraph test even though he knew he would fail. Some believe that he is so narcissistic that he thought he could actually take the test and pass. But what if it didn't have anything to do with being narcissistic? Chris took a plea deal in order to avoid the death penalty and waived his right to a fair trial. A trial would likely bring out more information that contradicts the official narrative. Quickly closing the case is the best way to avoid anyone questioning any inconsistencies. Many believe Nicole Kessinger played a much bigger role in the murders. However, the reason she was never investigated, why she has never been charged, and most likely will never be charged, is because the official narrative being fed over and over to the public is that Chris Watts killed his family. Why do you think Nicole Kessinger was hardly mentioned in any of the mainstream media documentaries? And the few times she was made out to look like a hero. The predictive programming used in the television show American Horror Story prior to the murders is overwhelming and started as far back as Season 1, which aired in 2011. This means that someone had foreknowledge that these murders were going to happen, and ultimately showed us what would later become a real-life American Horror Story for the whole world to see. Why would they do all this? Ole Damengard, an expert on false flags, psyops, and conspiracy theories, explains it best.
They secretly create an alleged terror attack or alleged mass shooting, alleged virus attack, alleged financial crash, something like that. Right. They create the problem. The reason they create that is to get us into an emotional reaction. They don't want us to think, they just want to get us emotional. So. Right. They freak us out so that we will be, oh my God, this is awful, awful. We don't think, we just react. There's a difference between reacting and acting. Acting is when you're in balance and in harmony and you make a well thought through decision and then you act. Reaction is just you go, oh my God, and that, but they don't want you to think. So it's the reaction they want, and emotional. So they aim at women and children to get the emotions going.
Yeah.
So see the problem to get the reaction. That's problem, reaction. Oh my God, help us. That's the reaction they want. And then we turn towards the few, to the ones that we think are there to protect us, not understanding that it's actually them who have created the problem, and say, please, please help us. We need protection. And they will let it say, well, the only way we can protect you is by, and boom, in comes the solution.
Right.
Problem, solution.
This case has brought fear and panic into women all over the world who feel they can no longer trust their husband or significant other to protect their family. If women can no longer trust their husband or significant other to protect their family, then who can they trust?